Welcome back to class. Welcome back to the second part of chapter 6, where we talk about some theoretical models. We are also going to define some very specific terms, for example, the so-called reservation wage. On this slide, it is claimed that workers receive a wage which is higher than the reservation wage. But what is a reservation wage in the first place? The definition is as follows. It is that wage level where the worker would be indifferent between working or being unemployed. This implies that the reservation wage is pretty low. In case that the wage rate would be lower by just 1 cent, the person would not show up at work anymore. The person would prefer to be unemployed. This is due to the fact that the worker is always weighing the two components, like the additional consumption one person can afford when this person is working. And this is compared to the leisure time, which is not available in case that one person has to show up at work. And this reservation wage is of course higher in case that the level of unemployment benefits is higher. In case that the government increases the unemployment benefits tremendously, then of course every worker would think twice to work for a very low wage rate and would demand a higher wage rate in order to show up at work. So the government can also influence this reservation wage by looking and providing unemployment benefits. Furthermore, it's claimed here that the wages are the higher, the lower the unemployment rate, because when the unemployment rate is low, then the companies have problems to replace workers, and workers themselves have more valuable outside options, and they find also a job at a different company. So in case that the unemployment rates are low, the worker or the labor unions have a better bargaining power, and they can agree upon higher wages. It was already mentioned in the previous slide that the wage rate, the actual wage rate, is higher than the reservation wage. And here it is mentioned that companies have an incentive to pay a higher wage rate than the reservation wage. Why is that the case? In order to understand that, it makes sense to look at this case study of the Ford company. And in this case study, it is mentioned that Ford increased the wage rate from $2.3 for a 9-hour shift to $5 for an 8-hour shift. So more or less, it is the case that here the wage rate more than doubled. So you can regard the $2.3 for a 9-hour shift as a kind of a reservation wage, where the people were indifferent to show up at work or to stay at home. But when Ford increases the wage rate to the level of $5, then the wage rate is higher than the reservation wage, and people have an incentive to show up. And this is mentioned in the next bullet, like the turnover rate decreases from 370% in 1913 to 16% in 1915. Layoff rate decreases, absenteeism decreases, and this is very important to the Ford company. Turnover rate decreases from almost 400% to 16%. What does a turnover rate of 400% imply? A turnover rate of 400% implies that the whole labor force is shifted out 4 times a year. So when we start in January with one labor force, in the end of March, the complete labor force is shifted out. Then once more in the end of June, in the end of September and in the end of December, we are working with a completely different workforce. And this is, of course, against the idea of Ford, who thinks that it would be a good idea to produce cars at this kind of assembly line where every worker has to be a specialist. Every worker has to be a specialist to fix this or to screw at this item. And it's very important that every worker is a specialist in his very specific field, because else the assembly line would stop every few minutes. And this would be impossible to come up with this very efficient assembly line technique when we have a turnover rate of 400%. So it was in the best interest of the Ford company to increase the actual wage rate above the reservation wage. In the next slide, we get to know a new term, like the term efficiency wage. Let's have a look at the assumptions of this model. We assume that workers can work hard or they can be lazy, and that workers prefer to be lazy. We have an asymmetric information relationship between the employer and the employee. The employer cannot observe the effort level completely. So the employer cannot completely check whether one employee is working hard or is being lazy. And the worker now balances the degree of laziness. The worker has to solve the following problem. There is some utility because when the worker avoids working hard, that's a positive effect for his utility. And then there are some costs because there is a probability of detection, and then this person will be laid off, and we have to multiply through the cost of being laid off by the likelihood of being detected. And in the end, this determines the cost, like the probability of detection multiplied by the cost of being unemployed, not to receive the wage rate anymore. The worker will only work hard if his cost of unemployment is high and the company is able to influence the cost of being unemployed, because the company can increase the worker's cost by offering a very high wage rate. The company will pay a higher wage rate compared to the reservation wage, and this high wage rate is called the efficiency wage. So the efficiency wage is definitely higher than the reservation wage. So when the company is able to establish a very high wage rate, then the cost of unemployment is very high for the worker, and the worker will answer with a very high work effort. Another theoretical model where also one asymmetric information relationship plays a role is the application process. We are assuming that job applicants have different qualification levels, like high or low. One worker is a good worker and another worker is a bad worker. We have an asymmetric information relationship between the applicant and the employer. The applicant knows his type, so the applicant knows whether he's a good worker or whether he's a bad worker. In case that the employer would know whether a person is a good or a bad worker, wage differentiation would be possible. The employer would give a high wage to those workers which have a high qualification and a low wage to workers which have a low qualification. But here we assume that wage differentiation is not possible because of the fact that the employer is not able to know the type of applicant. So one idea is that the employer offers a wage contract with an average wage rate. So for example, if a good worker is able to earn like 2,000 euros and a bad worker only 1,000 euros, one idea could be to offer an average wage of 1,500. But the good applicant knows that he deserves 2,000, but the company only offers 1,500. And maybe it will be the case that the good workers do not sign the contract. The bad workers, they know that they are only worth 1,000, but they receive a job offer of 1,500. So they are overpaid, and all the people with low qualification levels, they will accept this labor contract. And we call this process adverse selection process. It is the case that only the bad workers sign the contract, while the good workers do not sign. And in the end, it could be the case that the company ends up with 100% bad workers, which receive a wage rate of 1,500 instead of 1,000. It could be also the case that the workers with the above qualification, like the good workers, that they take the job offer, but they will also keep on searching for a higher paid job. So we will see a higher turnover rate among the high-skilled workers. So it might also be the case that the high-skilled workers accept the wage rate of 1,500, but they directly try to find one company which is paying 2,000. So we have a higher turnover among the high qualified people, and hence in the end we also have a selection process that the high skilled workers leave the company while the low skilled workers, they stay in the company, like the lemons stay in the company forever. In this part of the lecture we got to know some smaller theoretical approaches which are analyzing the one or the other situation at the labor market. It's not a fully fledged model now. This will be introduced in the next video. I'll give you a few minutes to digest what you have learned so far. So have a nice day. Thank you very much. Bye bye.